Hello and what's up to you all, Mindsetters? It is a lovely Thursday and it is time for geography. I know that you guys have been waiting for this subject. So here I am, Abram and Michelle, to give in a very insightful lesson and a show to be never forgotten. Michelle, how are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you, Abram?
I'm good, and it's a lovely Thursday. Hey, it was after a holiday, so the Mindsetters should be fresh, hey?
Well, hopefully they're refreshed. I mean, they've had 2 weeks of holidays, so let's see if they can respond well to our questions. Let's see if we can prepare them for their exams, which are not so long away.
Awesome. So there's no more time for you guys. So the only time that you have it is to study, learn more, and learn extra with us. All you need to do to participate on today's show is to go to facebook.com/learn extra, like the page, share the page with all your friends. I know that, Michelle, you've also liked our page, right?
Yes, I have.
And you are going to tell other teachers, right?
Well, I don't have to tell other teachers because my students are telling other teachers as well.
Awesome. I like that. That's the spirit, Mindsetters. Let's share the page with everybody, your teachers, your classmates, everyone. And then also follow us on Twitter at LearnExtra. Now, to stand a chance of winning this awesome Casio calculator, you see, it's a very funky calculator with about 255 functions. It's cool. It is a handy tool for you in exams and out of exams. So all you need to do is to fill in your right answers on the Test Yourself link that it will be provided on Facebook. And then if you get most questions right before 12 o'clock on Monday, you stand a chance of winning this awesome calculator. During the show, I'll be announcing last week's winners, so stay tuned for that.
Thank you very much, Abram. All right, today we're going to be dealing with rural settlements. And while some people may think it's a rather daunting section, actually it isn't. It's a lot easier than the physical geography with which we've been dealing in previous sessions. On to the rural settlement notes then. In this lesson, we are going to explain the difference between nucleated or clustered and dispersed settlement. We're going to review the different classifications of settlement in terms of size. We're also going to revise the different shapes of settlements, of rural settlements specifically, and discuss the factors that influence them. We're also going to discuss the difference between site and situation, a very important part. And last but not least, we are going to also look at examining the physical and economic factors that influence the site of a settlement. Before we move on, however, let's have a look at our challenge question. We need to describe and explain, so usually that would be for about 4 marks, the relationship between the population size of a settlement and the number of service centers in a settlement. So you need to describe what the relationship is and you need to explain why that relationship exists. Let's see if you can answer that one later on. Let's go through the rest of the notes. The first thing that we need to deal with is the difference between a clustered or a nucleated settlement and a dispersed or an isolated settlement. You must remember to look very carefully at the settlement on the maps or the topographic maps that they give you, especially in your map book exam, because they will point out a cluster of buildings or a block reference on a topographical map, and they will ask you to describe the pattern of that settlement. And it can only be either or, nucleated or dispersed. Let's have a look at the definition. Nucleated or clustered patterns occur when the buildings in a settlement are grouped together or they're clustered together. Isolated or dispersed patterns occur when the buildings in a settlement are spread out, so they're dispersed over an area. Let's have a look at the diagrams. In the first diagram, the nucleated pattern, have a look how all the buildings are clustered together in little groups. We call that a nucleated pattern. Have a look at the dispersed pattern. You'll notice that there's quite a far distance between each of those buildings. They're spread out over an area. A linear pattern occurs more for shapes of settlements, but in this case, this linear pattern, all the buildings you'll see are arranged along a linear feature, like a river or a road. Let's have a look at the next set of notes. We also need to look at settlement in terms of their classification of size. Now, if you have a look at the diagram, you'll notice that the smallest settlement is an isolated farmstead or a dwelling. The largest one on this particular diagram is a conurbation. Now, let me just tell you that we're only really going to be dealing with the first few levels of settlements in rural settlements. The smallest possible dwelling that we can get or settlement that we can possibly get is an isolated farmstead. That's just when there's one building on a farm. And we usually also deal with hamlets or villages when we're looking at rural settlement. If we have a look at the note, dispersed settlements include isolated homesteads or farmsteads and hamlets. And we say that they are unifunctional. Uni, meaning one function, means that most of these settlements are only associated with one activity, usually only one primary activity. And most of the time, these settlements are only really involved in agriculture. Other examples could be mining or fishing or forestry, but only one specific function pertains to these type of settlements. If we have a look at nucleated settlements, they include villages where buildings will be clustered together, towns, especially for urban settlements, cities, metropolises, conurbations, and megalopolises. Now, that's more for urban settlements, but when you deal with a conurbation, basically it means that large urban centers, such as large cities, have almost merged together. A lot of development has occurred between them, almost making it seem as though there's one massive city. Even bigger than that is a megalopolis. And examples of that would be along the eastern coast of the USA, when it's just one continuous urban sprawl, as well as over Europe. They actually call that settlement the blue banana, where lots of cities have merged together through developments that have occurred between them. If we have a look at the notes here, they talk about them being multifunctional. Multifunctional means that there are a range of economic activities that are occurring in these settlements. So multifunctional would include services like a bank, like a school, hospitals, could also include agriculture, but the point is that there are lots of activities occurring in those settlements. Let's have a look at the next page. All right, settlement shapes. We get a number of settlement shapes, and these shapes occur for many different reasons. So if we have a look at the first example that we have here, you'll notice that all your buildings are kind of clustered in a circular fashion, and we refer to that as a circular shape. If we have a look at the next particular diagram, a linear shape, linear usually meaning a shape rather than a pattern. All the buildings are arranged in one line along a linear feature. And usually key things to look out for when you're looking at a linear shape is the fact that there's a road or even a railway line or a river along which all these buildings are situated. If we have a look at the next example, you'll notice that all your buildings are kind of gathered around intersections of transport routes, railway links, and usually they're gathered around or situated or built along transport networks to ease access of transport for people getting to work, for businesses, etc. If we have a look at each of the different types in a table format, our first one was circular, where the buildings are situated around a central important area or building, like a church. Crossroads, or an X shape, means that buildings are situated at intersection of roads or even railways. If we have a look at the next one, a T shape, buildings are situated at a T junction where two roads meet. And a linear shape is where the buildings are situated around, or along rather, a linear feature like a road or a river. So the way that they will ask this in your test or exam is they will give you a topographic map, and they will point out a certain settlement, and they will ask you firstly for the pattern. Now that can only be nucleated or dispersed, but the shape is circular or linear or crossroads based on features that have caused those buildings to be built there. Let's have a look at the next notes. You need to know the difference between site and situation. And a lot of people get confused between the two. So a site is the actual physical piece of land on which a settlement is built. So the piece of ground below the settlement. It could be an area with fertile soil, for example. Okay? A situation that is defined by the settlement in relation to surrounding features. And I'll try and give you an example to explain that difference as well. So let's have a look at the note. The site is the actual place or piece of land on which a settlement is built, whereas the situation is where the settlement is in relation to its surrounding features. An example, Kimberley, it's actually built on a poor site. Okay, doesn't have very fertile soil. It's a very dry area, generally speaking, but its close proximity to areas where there were diamonds made it an advantageous situation. All right, so situation looks at features in the area around your settlement. So we usually look at a feature in terms of its direction from the settlement, and the site is the actual piece of ground on which your settlement is placed. Let's have a look at the next note. We need to also look at factors that affect the particular site of a settlement. And that's quite important because usually they'll ask you shape, pattern, and they ask you for quite a few marks to explain why this particular settlement potentially chose that site. So let's have a quick look at them. The physical factors include things like a fresh water supply, okay, where we have permanent water supplies that define the location of the settlement. For example, a wet point settlement, okay? So a wet point settlement means that a settlement has chosen to, or people have chosen to build their settlements in an area where there is water. So let's say that they're in a desert or desert-like region, and then there's an oasis. They will choose to build their settlement around that water supply at the wet point in a dry area. Okay. The next thing, sometimes settlements are built in order to avoid water, dry point settlements, where the site is chosen to avoid the danger of flooding in a wet area. All right, so this would usually be in an area where there's lots of rivers, high rainfall. They're going to build their settlement above the floodplain, for example, in a dry point at a dry site to avoid the dangers of flooding. If we have a look at the next one. Farming is where we have arable, fertile land, or good land for grazing, decent grazing land, or flat areas where the gradient is gentle. We also look for sites with building materials in rural settlements and energy sources, for example, wood, clay, grass, mud, which may be used in a lot of traditional rural settlements to construct homes, for example, as well as to provide wood for fires and warmth. If we have a look at the microclimates, okay, that's always inclusive in your exams. We look at things like slope aspect, which we'll look at in your questions later, and the idea of inversion layers. Remember, inversion layers mean that temperature increases with altitude, which usually occurs upslope in your valley. At the bottom of the valley is where all that frost collects, all that cold air sinks in, and a lot of frost occurs right on the valley floor. So you wouldn't really want to build your house or have a settlement where you're going to get frost every morning. We have a look at relief. It's easier to build and farm on a gentle gradient on flat land. If we have a look lastly at the economic factors, we have to consider the feasibility. Is it going to be useful or not for commercial farming? Commercial farming usually needs very large tracts of land in order to farm effectively. We look for places with natural harbors so we can fish, so we can trade effectively with neighboring countries. We look for tourist attractions and ecotourism, Places like Skokuza, that's a settlement in the Kruger Park, which has been built because of that surrounding tourist attraction. Those are all the notes. I think it's time for a break, Abram.
Yes, it is. And I must remind you, Mindsetters, that this show is proudly sponsored by Macmillan. And during this break, you have the challenge question on Facebook, and you also have the test yourself questions so that you can stand a chance of winning this awesome Casio calculator. We'll see you after the break. Welcome back, Mindsetters. If you just joined us now, you're a bit late, but I'm sure that as Michelle is taking us slowly but surely getting there, I'm sure you're still going to catch up. Tell all your friends and talk to me on facebook.com/learnextra. Let me know how's the show. If you have any questions, we're more than willing to help you, because this is where you need to get all the help that you need. Extra help, though.
Thank you, Abram. Let's continue with a couple of questions that are very similar to the ones that you can be expected to find in your exam. Usually they're associated with a diagram, which could be in the form of a sketch, or it could be in the form of a topographical map. So you need to really look very carefully at, firstly, whether or not the buildings are clustered together or they spread apart. You need to have a look and see what sort of activities that are involved in that particular area. So perhaps you've got very large tracts of cultivated land which suggest commercial farming, or perhaps we've got very small tracts of land with no dams, no irrigation, no internal networks that would look at subsistence farming. All of these things have a lot to do with the way settlements are spread out over an area. They also ask you things like, is it unifunctional or multifunctional? So when you're looking for things that are multifunctional, have a look for things like churches or places of worship, look for hospitals, look for post offices, police stations, which could indicate that a settlement is rather multifunctional as opposed to unifunctional. So there's a lot to take in all at once, but we're going to go through this diagram. There's a few challenging questions that I hope that you'll be able to answer with me. So let's see how we go. If you have a look at this diagram, we have to study it carefully, right? And we have to assume that it represents a place in South Africa. We need to do that in order to answer the following questions. But before we get to the questions, let's have a closer look at the diagram. If we have a look here, we'll notice the first thing is that there's a river running through the area, or flowing through the area, and it reaches its mouth at the sea. We'll notice that there's a settlement called Bleum, and you'll notice there's a couple of buildings which seem to be grouped together. You'll notice that there's an isolated sort of farmstead in the form of Bleedale, and also that there's a linear settlement here at Balmouth. Have a look as well at the direction in which the particular map is facing. They tell us that north is there, and that's always important because they like to incorporate things like aspects into these questions, and pay very careful attention to which hemisphere your diagram is situated in, because remember, we need to know where a north-facing slope is, where a south-facing slope is, because that influences very heavily where a settlement will choose as its site. All right, if you have a look as well, you'll notice in this region, okay, our contour lines are very close together, so that means that the slope is probably quite steep, or it is very steep. And you'll notice in the southern part of the map, this region here, that the contours are more widely spaced, indicating that it's a more gentle slope. Remember, it's not a very good idea to build on very steep areas. You're prone to things like rock falls, landslides. On a gentle gradient, it's easier to build and it's easier to farm. You don't get so much runoff, you don't get so much erosion, or you don't get so much mass movement, which could influence your home eventually. Let's have a look at the questions. Right, the first one. What settlement pattern is evident at Bleum? If we have a look again at the map, just to refresh our memories, you'll remember that I said those buildings seem to be grouped together. So there are two words that we can use, and you must know them interchangeably because you need to be able to identify them at different times. First one is nucleated, and the second one is clustered. They both mean the same thing. Let's write that in. Right, so nucleated or clustered. And that will get you your 2 marks. Let's have a look at the next question. Give 2 advantages of this type of settlement pattern. Right. It's very important that you got the first question right, because you need to be able to distinguish between the advantages and disadvantages of both dispersed and nucleated settlements. And if you really think about them, a lot of those advantages and disadvantages are fairly logical. You could probably come up with them on your own. Right. So if you're thinking about a clustered group of buildings and the advantages that you could have living there, remember it's not very safe to live in a small farmstead by yourself. So for reasons of security and safety, people in nucleated settlements often live close to one another. You've got a neighbor to help you. Let's say you need to go to the hospital. Let's say you have someone breaking in. You need that security. It also builds a sense of community. And in a lot of areas where we have farms, especially subsistence farming, a lot of people will cluster together so that they can share the workload of that farm. So there are quite a few advantages to living in that area. If we have a look at the other side, a dispersed settlement, you wouldn't really want to live there because of security issues, reasons. You might be far from things like services and hospitals, and you might have an increased workload, but on the other hand, you would get to keep all the profits from your farm. So it does have an upside and a downside, whether you're looking at nucleated or dispersed settlements. Let's have a look at the question again. All right. So 2 advantages, a sense of community, all right, safety in numbers, and we can also share the workload, especially if you're working on a farm. We only needed 2 there, but I've given you 3. Let's have a look at the next question. They ask us, what settlement shape is evident at Balmouth? Give a reason to support your answer. Now, unfortunately, and I know you're going to be working quickly in your exams, so you read the first part of the question and you forget to answer the second part as well. So make sure you're taking your time when you're answering these questions, because this is a really easy section to score lots of marks. So we're looking at the settlement shape, not pattern. Remember, there's a difference between pattern and shape. Pattern, nucleated or dispersed. The shape could be circular, could be crossroads, T-junction, etc. Let's have a look at the map to see which particular shape it is. Right, all the way up there again. We noticed at Balmouth that there is a road, okay, and all of our buildings are kind of gathered along that road. A road is a linear feature, so therefore the shape of the settlement must be linear. Okay, very easy. Let's write that in. Right, it's a linear shape, and the reason is the buildings, they are arranged along a linear feature, and that could be a river, but in this case it's a road. And that will get you your 2 marks, linear shape there, and the second 2 marks for explaining it properly. Let's have a look at the next question. It asks you to describe 3 factors that could have influenced the site of Bleum. Just pay careful attention to the instructions that you must follow when you're answering your questions. To describe simply means to write a simple sentence telling us about that particular site or situation, or the factors. if you're wanting to explain or discuss something, that requires a little bit more. So if you only write a phrase or a word when they ask you to discuss, they're not going to give you any marks. So you must pay careful attention to the instructions in your paper as well. So let's have a look again at the particular diagram, and then we'll answer it. Right. Let's have a look at Bliam again. So there's Bliam once more. I pointed out to you that in this particular region, the contour lines are spaced quite widely. So that means that area has a fairly flat or a uniform gradient even. And so we said earlier that it's easier to construct a building, it's easier to farm on a flat surface. So that's one thing, all right? Now we also need to look at its access to roads. So here's a road over here, and there's another one right by the settlement. Generally, people are clustered around major transport networks because it's easier to get onto a main road or a highway, okay, etc. So that's the second reason. We also notice that if this is the north-facing slope, okay, well this is north direction, it means that this particular slope is also facing north. This slope over here facing south. Okay, so when we did microclimates last term, you needed to remember that in the southern hemisphere, north-facing slopes, just think about the fact that they're facing the equator where it's hotter. So north-facing slopes receive direct sunlight. So that means those slopes are going to be quite a lot warmer. And if you think about your own homes, if you have a bedroom that's facing the north, you'll notice that you get a lot of nice afternoon sunshine. It makes it nice and warm in winter. So generally people like their homes to be built on a north-facing slope, or at least to be facing north, so that they get that natural warmth without having to use heaters or fires and things like that. So the fact that it's on a north-facing slope, that's a very big factor that has influenced its position. Let's have a look at the question so we can add some answers. Right, so the first one was that there was a gentle gradient, and we're just describing it. So gentle gradient, so it's easier to build. We also said that it's close to transport networks. So it's close to roads. It's easy to access those roads. Okay? And it's also north-facing. Well, it's on a north-facing slope, which means that in the southern hemisphere, let's put that one in brackets, it's going to be warmer. So we needed 3 things. There they are. 2 marks for that one, 2 for there, and 2 for there. 6 marks, and that is a really easy question. Let's have a look at the next question. It asks us to describe the situation of Balmouth. Okay, let's just reiterate the difference between site and situation yet again, so that you can get it right in your exam. Site, actual piece of ground on which the settlement is built. Situation, where is that settlement in relation to surrounding features? Okay, so let's have a look at Balmouth and see what we can find. All right. So if we have a look at Balmouth, again, this area here, we notice that the sea is in this direction. Okay, so it seems that the coastline is along the eastern side. So if we're assuming that this is in South Africa, it means it's on the east coast. And we know that climates along the east coast are generally quite warm because of a warm ocean current. So you can even talk about climates in terms of your situation. On the east coast, warm, humid type of climate. If we have a look at other features, you'll see that it is southeast of Albert's Shack, all right? And we also know that it is northeast of Bliam. Right, so include directions when you're talking about situation. You're telling where it is in relation to surrounding features. Let's have a look at the question again. Right, so we know it's on the east coast, which I said to you is fairly warm if we're talking about South Africa. We know that it was, let me just check again, that it was to the northeast of Bleem. Northeast of Bleem. And it was to the southeast of Albert's shack. Right, but we only needed 2 there. So there's your 2 marks there and 2 marks there. Very simple, very nice. Right, now we're going to deal with Albert's shack. We need to discuss 3 reasons, to discuss them, to explain why Albert's shack is not placed on a good site. Let's have a look quickly. And I've drawn a lot on here, but we can still see what's going on. Remember, I spoke about a steep gradient here. This is a south-facing slope, okay, facing the south. You'll also note that it's quite close to the river. So there's a couple of things that would worry me if I were to build there, okay? So a steep slope, not easy to build on. You can also be prone to things like rock falls, which are dangerous. You can't really farm on a steep slope either because you're going to get so much runoff and so much soil erosion that you're not going to have a good yield. If you're on a south-facing slope, it's going to be a bit cold because in the southern hemisphere, south-facing slopes receive oblique, less direct sunlight, and it casts them in what we call a shadow zone, making it quite a bit cooler. So it's not a very good place to build your house if you're on a south-facing slope. In addition to that, it's right close to the river. And if you're right on the floodplain of that river, it means that you're very prone to flooding. So there's a couple of reasons why it's not a good site. Okay, let's go to our answer. All right, so steep slope, not a good idea. It's difficult to build on. And there's rock falls. Okay, mass movements. Right? The second one that we said was that it's a south-facing slope. You need to explain that in the southern hemisphere, south-facing slopes are generally going to be cooler. It's also on the floodplain. So that means that you're going to be very susceptible to flooding. So it's not a very good choice of site. Let's have a look at question 7. Last question. Would Bleem be considered a unifunctional or a multifunctional settlement? Remember to read the whole question. Give a reason to support your answer. All right. So remember we said unifunctional means there's only one activity going on in that settlement. Whereas if we're talking about multifunctional, it means there's lots of services. There could be lots of industries. There could be farming as well. Lots of different things, multifunctional. So if we have a look at our map again, one more time. Right. There's Bleem again. I can't see any services. There's no church there. There's no post office. There's no police station. There's no symbols indicating any other services. So we have to assume that it is unifunctional. It might be a farmland area, but unless it includes other services, it means it's unifunctional. Let's write that down. Right. Unifunctional. There are no industries or services evident, or no symbols for those services or industry present. And those are most of them are the types of questions that you can expect in an exam. I think that's all we have time for in terms of questions for now. Back to you, Abram.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and a big shout out to Karen Nichivia. who's watching the show saying, hey, it's my first time on Mindset and I'd like to learn more with you guys. Thank you so much, Karen, and welcome. And Mindsetters, thank you for your answers on the challenge question. Remember, after the break, I'll be announcing the winners of the Casio calculators from last week's show. So do stay tuned. Welcome back, Mindsetters. You're watching a Geography live show, proudly sponsored by Macmillan. And now, as promised to you, I'm going to be announcing the winners for the last week's show. The winners of this awesome Casio calculator is Lerato Mahlangu. Congratulations to you, Lerato Mahlangu, and Mphela Mugau. Welcome to, congratulations to you too, Mphela Mugau. Those are the two winners. Congratulations, guys. Remember, Mindsetters, you still have a chance to enter. All you need to do is to click on the link that is on Facebook, written test yourself, and then it will take you to a form, a Google form. Fill in the right answers. If you get most answers correct before 12 o'clock on Monday, then you stand a chance of winning these awesome Casio calculators. Winners of this week's show will be announced next week at Thursday. So all the best and good luck. Now, Michelle, time for us to get the challenge question answer.
All right, so the challenge question that I gave you, let's just go through it again and then I'll answer it. Let's see if you got it right. I asked you to describe, okay, so first describe for 2 marks and explain, so explain why there is a relationship between the population size of a settlement and the number of service centers or services in a settlement. Okay, so you need to think about an idea called a threshold population. So when we are talking about, let's say, doctors' rooms, okay, let's say in Johannesburg, we're going to have a lot of different doctors because every doctor can only handle, let's say, 50 patients, all right? So if we've got, let's say, 200,000 people living in one area, it means we can have lots of doctors there because we have lots of people to sustain the livelihood or to sustain the practice of that doctor. So as the demand for a service increases, so there is an opportunity for more of those services to exist because the population, that threshold population, is large enough to support all those services. All right, so let's just write that down just to clarify it. So I said to you that as the population size increases, okay, the services will also increase, or the service centers will also increase. And the reason for that, we also need to add in, right, we need to say that a larger population can sustain more services, so they can keep them going, in other words. And you can also add in there that a larger population creates a greater demand. A greater demand for those services. And I hope you managed to get that one right. That would be more of a higher level questions. Let's see if we have any other questions coming through, Abraham.
Well done to all the Mindsetters that got the challenge question correct, and those who have tried, of course. There's a first question from Lesego saying, what is the difference between site and situation?
Okay, Lesego, just to reiterate that. It's easy to get them confused, all right? But site is the actual physical piece of ground that you build your house on, okay? So it could be around an oasis, or it could be in a dry area away from a river to prevent flooding, or it could be on fertile soil. So the immediate position upon which you choose to build your house or your settlement, okay? Situation, it kind of goes slightly further afield. it looks at surrounding features in relation to your particular settlement, all right? So let's say we're talking about Johannesburg, its situation. We can say that it's in the northeast of South Africa. It's in Gauteng as a province. We can say it's situated south of Pretoria, okay? We can say that the coastline, the east coast, is, let's say, 600 kilometers to the east, right? So we're usually looking at something in relation to settlements, to features around that particular settlement. Not the ground on which it's placed, it's the features that are around it. Could be at quite a distance as well. I hope that helps.
I hope that helps too. Another one from Serena Malebu Machila. I'm writing a test tomorrow. May you please explain the advantages and disadvantages of different settlement patterns?
All right. Okay, so usually they are going to ask you to list 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages of a clustered or a nucleated pattern, okay? So think logically as well. Most of the time you can actually come up with these on your own if you really think about it. So nucleated or a clustered pattern, if you're living together, all right, it's safer, safety in numbers. So think about that. Okay, if you're working on a field or you're farming, think if you were in a rural village, you don't want to have to plow the fields or harvest them by yourself. So you can share the chores, share the workload with other people around you. Even the idea of a social sense of community it builds. Right, so those are 2 advantages, all right? Disadvantages, however, is you own a smaller piece of land, and if you are farming, you're going to have to share the profits with everybody else. Your privacy is probably a bit limited, especially if you've got neighbors very, very close to you. If you know one set of advantages and disadvantages for clustered or nucleated settlement patterns, for example, you can also work out the dispersed advantages and disadvantages because they're opposites, all right? So in a dispersed settlement, you've got the advantage of owning all your own land and keeping all the profits, especially let's say you're a commercial farmer, you're going to have a big plot of land and you're going to keep those profits. You also have a lot of privacy, okay? So you're not going to have someone invading your personal space. However, a couple of disadvantages is the fact that, well, you're probably far away from services. You're going to be far away from a shop or far away from the doctor or a hospital if you're in an emergency. And if you live by yourself, who's going to come and fetch you or who's going to come and help you in times of need, all right? You also have to do all the work yourself. You might have a big farm and you might have some mechanization, but if you need to get some work done, you're the only one that can do it, okay? It's also not particularly safe to live on a large plot of land far away from other people because obviously our crime level will increase if you're isolated by yourself. So most of the time you're going to get 2 advantages, 2 disadvantages, or 3 advantages. So if you can just learn 2 or 3 of each, your dispersed and nucleated advantages and disadvantages, you should be fine for tomorrow, and I really hope you are. Next question.
All the best. Before I take this next question, I've got some great compliments from the mindsetters. Actually, 2 mindsetters that are watching the show for the first time. First one is Paseka Joanne is saying, it is also my first time to watch Mindsetter, and I like it because we can learn more. Thank you guys for educating us. So thank you, Paseka, and keep on watching even other shows. Lesego Mugatusi is saying, okay, well, I'm also new on Mindset Learn Extra, and I can tell already that it is a very interesting program for learning. I'm so enjoying it. Thank you so much, Lesego. Last question for you, Michelle. This question is from Dimpo. Q, it's based on Q. Q is a bell mouth. Is it a unifunctional or multifunctional because of the church sign?
Good question. If you've got lots of services, like a church, it probably would be more multifunctional. You probably find that they farm as well there. So when you see services like a shop or a police station or a church, then talk about it being multifunctional, because that settlement won't just be there because of the church. They're probably involved in other activities as well. And most of the time when you do it on your topographical map, you'll actually see more services. So it'll make it easier to identify. So yes, I would agree with you that one's probably multifunctional.
Awesome. That's it on the questions for now.
Good. All right. Are we going to go through some other questions or?
I have some announcements before we take other
Okay.
questions. So Mindsetters, if you still have some questions, feel free to go to facebook.com/learnextra learnextra or on Twitter, Twitter's @learnextra. I'll be looking on Twitter also, what are you guys saying? And thank you for following us. Now, this is a very important announcement. Tonight from 7 o'clock, we have a sports show. It's called The Wrap. All you need to do is to just tune in. Stay glued on your screens because this afternoon it's happening sports-wise. It is a magazine talk show whereby they do interviews, reviews. It's for sports. So make sure that you watch that show. It's called The Wrap. So we're bringing sports and education at the same time. How funky is that?
That's good. It's always important to make sure you're enjoying your education. Otherwise, it's going to seem a rather laborious task to learn.
So
from
true.
Moody Lab.
And something that you mentioned earlier on, that Mindsetters should get resources out there. I have shared a link of the past exam papers, Mindsetters. So go to facebook.com/learnextra and look at that link. Download it. Download the notes that are there, the past exam papers, and then share also with other Mindsetters, your friends, your classmates.
Go to the past papers on the government website because they go all the way back to 2006, I think. And although we're doing the CAP syllabus now, a lot of the sections, the rural settlement, urban settlement, and a lot of the climate actually is almost exactly the same. And the way and the manner in which they ask questions or the examiners ask questions is quite daunting to get used to. So get used to the phrasing, get used to how they ask them, get used to all the diagrams that you're going to see. And the more you practice those past papers, the better and better you're going to get.
So true, and that's the point that John also mentioned, saying that not everything will be useful still today, but you need to look through and see what you can take and what you cannot take.
Exactly.
But here's a question from Kani saying, so the fact that there is a farm instead of a farmstead and the father decided to build a house for his son, what's that pattern?
Okay, so if we have one property and one farmstead and then maybe another building attached to it, we'd probably still classify that as an isolated farmstead. I think if we're looking at more buildings than just two houses or two little buildings, then we're going to be looking at a hamlet. All right, so often there's a bit of a grey area between your classifications of settlements. So in an exam, they would probably accept an isolated farmstead more likely. You have a few more buildings that are clustered together, it's more likely to be a hamlet. All right.
All right. Here's another mindset saying, I did not understand I did not understand the difference between the classifications of settlements. Can you please just recap on that?
Good. All right, so when we're looking at the classification of settlements, we usually look at it in terms of things like population size. Okay, so we go right from the bottom, and the smallest population size, the smallest settlement, is your isolated farmstead. And when I was teaching this section to my matrics, I actually showed them a photo. It's of a little settlement in North America somewhere. It's got a population of 2, okay? But it's still classified as an isolated farmstead as a settlement because it has people living there, and it's also got infrastructure there. It's got its own road, it's got buildings, so it's still a settlement. So as we find more buildings and more people living in a settlement, we progress to the next level. So like a hamlet, a very small settlement, you won't really have many services there at all, but a group of buildings or a couple of buildings will be present there. Your population size will be marginally bigger. From there, we get to a village. Right? Villages are more common in like the UK, in England, for example. They've got a lot of buildings which tend to be clustered together. The population size is a little bit bigger, and we have more services and things like that there. So those three, the isolated farmstead, the hamlets, as well as the village, are generally classified as your rural settlements. So if they say classified in terms of size, you're looking at those 3 for rural settlements: isolated farmstead, a hamlet, as well as a village. It looks at their physical size. Once we move on from that, it goes to towns and cities and a metropolis, a conurbation, which means that the population size gets bigger and the actual physical size and number of buildings in the settlement gets bigger. Any other questions?
Okay, here's another one. Where in S can we find a megapolis?
Where in?
Where in S? I think it's the last question or a previous question.
Let's have a look there.
He's saying, where can we find the megapolis?
He might. Okay, I don't think it's pertaining to that diagram, but a megalopolis, okay, that's the biggest urban setting that you can get. So I mentioned an example earlier. We don't get a megalopolis in South Africa, but in North America, that whole eastern seaboard, all the way from Washington down to Boston, if you have a look at a photo, a Google Earth image, a night image, and you see all the lights, you'll see that that whole eastern seaboard is lit up. And that's because there's one continuous urban sprawl all the way down that east coast. So it's one long line of cities, pretty much. And we have the same sort of thing in Europe, going right from the north to the south of Europe as well. Lots of cities which have kind of joined together. All right.
Awesome. That's where we end it for today, Mindsetters. That's all we had time for, Michelle.
I think that's all we have time for, unfortunately.
Cool. Mindsetters, also make sure that you tune in to our Saturday shows. We do have shows for you guys. I will post the schedule on Facebook. Make sure that you check it out. And also, we're going to be having a schools boy rugby. It is the Sex versus the Bishop. So make sure that you catch that live from 11:30 to 1 o'clock on Saturday, the 10th of May. But for today, that's where we end it. We love you and peace.